Hello, welcome. My name is Eugene. I am a lecturer in Kenya. I teach professional courses such as SCCA and CPA. My videos cover various topics found in these professional courses. The main subjects covered are management accounting, performance management, and quantitative analysis. I welcome everyone interested in learning something. Sit back, relax, and let's begin. Hello, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will take you through activity-based costing. Introduction. Activity-based costing is a more precise method of allocating overheads to products, services, or customers based on the actual activities they consume. In traditional management accounting, overheads are often distributed using a single broad volume-based measure like machine hours. Activity-based costing recognizes that products consume different amounts of support activities, such as machine setups. Key components of activity-based costing. The first component is activities. An activity is a task or operation that consumes resources, for example, machine setup or inspection. The second component is cost pools. A cost pool is a group of individual costs associated with a particular activity. The third component is cost drivers. A cost driver is a factor that causes a change in the cost of an activity. For example, the number of setups. The fourth component is cost objects. A cost object is a product or service or customers that consume activities. Activity-based costing versus traditional costing. Under traditional costing, overhead allocation is done using a single basis, while under activity-based costing, overhead allocation is done using multiple cost drivers. Under traditional costing, the accuracy is lower, while under activity-based costing, the accuracy is higher. Under traditional costing, the overhead allocation process is simple, while under activity-based costing, the process of overhead allocation is complex. Traditional costing is best for homogeneous products, while activity-based costing is best for diverse, complex product lines. Steps in activity-based costing. 1. Identify the major activities involved in producing the organization's products or delivering its services. For example, machine setup. 2. Group all costs related to each activity into separate cost pools. For example, all costs related to machine setups will be in the setup cost pool. 3. Identify the factor that causes each activity's cost. These factors are known as cost drivers. For example, the cost driver could be the number of setups. 4. Determine the cost per unit of cost driver or cost driver rate for each cost pool. 5. Allocate costs to products or services based on their usage of the cost drivers. Advantages of activity-based costing. 1. Improved cost accuracy. Overheads are allocated based on actual consumption of activities, which gives a better estimate of the overhead cost per unit. 2. Better pricing. The costs under activity-based costing are more accurate, hence companies can set prices that will cover all the costs and make profits. 3. Better decision making. Activity-based costing help managers to identify unprofitable products, services, or customers. 4. Enhanced process understanding. Activity-based costing reveals inefficiencies in operations. For example, non-value activities such as unnecessary inspections. Disadvantages of activity-based costing. 1. Costs of implementation. Gathering the data to track activities and cost drivers requires time and investment in software. This could deter some organizations from using activity-based costing. 2. Arbitrary allocations. Some costs like rent must still be allocated somewhat arbitrarily. This could affect the accuracy of the overhead cost per unit. 3. Data overload. Managing dozens of cost pools can become overwhelming for small accounting departments. Example 1. A company has a total annual overhead cost of $851,580. The company has been using absorption costing to allocate overheads to its products. The company is now considering an activity-based costing system. Information for 2 products is as follows. In this table, we are given information about products X and Y, about the production volume, direct labor hours per unit, number of setups, and number of inspections. The annual overhead cost has been analyzed as follows. We have 2 cost pools, setup costs and inspection costs. Required: A. Calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product under absorption costing using direct labor hours as the basis for apportionment. B. Calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product using activity-based costing. Answer for example 1, part A. Using absorption costing, first we need to calculate the overhead absorption rate, the OAR. The formula is budgeted overheads divided by budgeted activity level. Since the basis for the apportionment is the direct labor hours, the activity level will be the total direct labor hours for products X and Y. To calculate the total labor hours for the 2 products, we take the labor hours per unit times the number of units. Using the data from the question, we find that the total direct labor hours is 10,260. Next, we get the overhead absorption rate per labor hour. We take the overhead cost divided by the total labor hours. That will give us $83. To get the overhead cost per unit, which we are calling the OAR per unit, we multiply the OAR per labor hour and the labor hours per unit. The overhead cost per unit for X will be $83 per hour times 0.9 hours per unit, giving us $74.7. Then the overhead cost per unit for Y will be $83 per hour times 1.9 hours per unit, which gives us $157.7. Answer for example 1, part B. Using activity-based costing, first we'll need to identify the cost driver for each cost pool and calculate the cost driver rate. For the first cost pool, the setup costs, the appropriate cost driver is the number of setups. We calculate the total number of setups for products X and Y, which is 80. To get the cost driver rate, we take the setup costs, $472,000, divided by the number of setups, 80. That gives us the cost driver rate of $5,900 per setup. For the second cost pool, inspection costs, the appropriate cost driver is the number of inspections. We calculate the total number of inspections for products X and Y, which is 500. To get the cost driver rates, we take the inspection costs, $379,580, divided by the number of inspections, 500. That gives us $759.16 per inspection. Next, we calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product. We first get the total setup cost and total inspection costs for the products. To calculate the total setup cost, we multiply the cost driver rate per setup times the number of setups for the product. For example, for X, we have $5,900 per setup times 20 setups. To calculate the total inspection cost, we take the cost driver per inspection times the number of inspections for the product. For example, for X, we take $759.16 per inspection times 40 inspections. Then we add the setup costs and inspection costs to get the total overhead cost. After that, we take the total overhead cost divided by the number of units to get the overhead cost per unit. For example, for X, we have the total overhead cost, $148,266.4 divided by 9,500 units, giving us overhead cost per unit of $15.62. Then the overhead cost per unit for Y is $781.35. Example 2. A company produces 3 products, X, Y, and Z. The company has been using traditional absorption costing to allocate overheads to its products. The company is now considering an activity-based costing system. The table below shows the data for the products. In the table, we have the data for budgeted units, labor hours per unit, the batch size in units, and the number of components per unit. The total fixed overheads are $360,000. The fixed overheads were analyzed as follows. We have 2 cost pools, setup costs, materials handling costs. Required: A, calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product under absorption costing using direct labor hours as the basis for apportionment. B, calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product using activity-based costing. Answer for example 2, part A. Using absorption costing, first we calculate the overhead absorption rate, the OAR. The formula is budgeted fixed overheads divided by budgeted activity level. The activity level is the total direct labor hours for the 3 products. To get the total labor hours for each product, we multiply the labor hours per unit times the number of units. For example, for product X, total labor hours will be 2.5 hours per unit times 10,000 units. We do the same for products Y and Z. Then we add the labor hours for the 3 products, giving us total labor hours of 45,000. Then we get the overhead absorption rate per labor hour. We take the overhead cost, $360,000, divided by 45,000 labor hours, giving us $8. Next, we get the overhead cost per unit using the formula OAR per unit equals to OAR per labor hour times the labor hours per unit. The overhead cost per unit for X will be $20. The overhead cost per unit for Y is $24. And the overhead cost per unit for Z is $16. Answer for example 2, part B. Using activity-based costing, first we'll need to identify the cost driver for the cost pool and calculate the cost driver rate. For the first cost pool, setup costs, the cost driver based on the information provided is the number of batches. We need to calculate the total number of batches for the 3 products. To calculate the number of batches, we take the total production units divided by the batch size. The batch size refers to the number of units in one batch. If you're looking at product X, we have 10,000 units in total and 5,000 units in a batch, giving us 2 batches. Similarly, Y will get 4 batches, and Z we have 2 batches. Total, we have 8 batches. The cost driver rate will be the setup cost, $270,000 divided by 8 batches, giving us $33,750 per batch. For the second cost pool, materials handling costs, the cost driver is the number of components. We need to calculate the total number of components for the 3 products. We are given the number of components per unit, which will multiply by the number of units for the product to get the total number of components. Looking at X, we have 10,000 units times 10 components per unit, giving us 100,000. Similarly, we'll end up with 75,000 components for Y and 12,500 components for Z. Overall, we have 187,500 components. To get the cost driver rate, we take the materials handling cost, $90,000 divided by 187,500 components, giving us $0.48 per component. Next, we calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product. First, we'll get the total setup cost for the product and the total materials handling cost for the product. To get the total setup cost, we multiply the cost driver rate per batch times the number of batches. For example, for X, we have $33,750 per batch times 2 batches. Then to calculate the total materials handling cost, we'll use the cost driver rate per component times the number of components. Again, for X, we have $0.48 per component times 100,000 components. To get the total overhead cost, we add the setup costs and the material handling costs. For product X, that is $115,500. To get the overhead cost per unit, you take the total overhead cost divided by total production units. For X, we get $11.55. Following the same process, the overhead cost per unit for Y is $34.2 and for Z, $29.4. Thank you for watching up to this point. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned a lot. Please support the channel by subscribing. Remember to like and comment. See you in the next video. Goodbye.